Something strange is happening in American politics right now, and you can see it most clearly when a cable news star looks into the camera and asks, with a straight face, "Why did the United States do this?" While half the country is yelling, "Because it's about time," and the other half is yelling, What are we even doing?" That tension isn't just about one foreign country or one TV host or one president. It's about trust collapsing at home and elites trying to manage that collapse with narratives instead of accountability. I want you to slow down and notice what this story is really made of, because it's not actually a personality drama about Rachel Maddow spiraling. The Maddow clip is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a political class and a media class that have trained themselves to treat foreign policy like a prop in a domestic culture war, while the costs land on normal people who never got a vote on any of it. Here as the core claim in the clip you were given: the United States took dramatic action against Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela, and Maddow questioned the rationale and the consistency of it. The commentary around her claims she's defending Maduro, and it tries to paint her as panicking because her own viewers don't agree with her anymore. Whether you like Maddow or can't stand her, that framing is designed to keep you from asking the more important question, which is this: what did Washington actually do? Why now? And what does it mean for your life, your wallet, your energy costs, your border, and your country's credibility? The first thing I want you to see is how quickly this got packaged into a cartoon morality play. One side says, dictator goes down, people celebrate, end of story. The other side says, America did something shady, and the explanation doesn't add up. And then the media machine does what it always does. It turns it into your team versus my team. So you never demand a coherent doctrine, a clear legal basis, or a realistic plan for what happens the day after the headline. If you've watched politics long enough, you know this pattern. Every time the system does something aggressive abroad, it sells it to you as clean, surgical, necessary, and humanitarian. Then, 2 years later, you find out the details were messier, the incentives were uglier, and the benefits flowed upward while the blowback flowed downward. That is not cynicism, that's memory. Now, let's talk about the specifics that were raised in the transcript, because the specifics matter. Maddow's argument, as presented, is basically that the administration's stated reasons don't survive a basic consistency check. She asks, if this is about drug trafficking, then why did President Trump just pardon the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of sending hundreds of tons of drugs into the United States? She asks, if this is about the illegitimacy of Maduro's election, then why is the U.S. acting like it gets to police that in a way it tells other countries not to do? That's not a small point, because consistency is the difference between law and power. A consistent standard is what tells the world you're serious, and it tells your own citizens that you're not being played. When standards become flexible, politics becomes a permission slip, and institutions become weapons. At the same time, the commentary clip tries to flip the spotlight away from those questions and back onto Maddow personally. It says, look at her, she's melting down, she's losing her audience. She used to say Trump would team up with Maduro because Trump is a dictator. And now she's upset that Maduro is being targeted. And I get why that hits emotionally, because hypocrisy is one of the most corrosive things in public life. But you need to be careful here, because hypocrisy is often used as a trap. The trap is that you get so focused on catching the other side being inconsistent that you stop asking whether the move itself is wise, lawful, and beneficial for the people who actually pay for it. You can win the hypocrisy argument and still lose the country. So let's separate two things. One, is Maddow consistent in her worldview, or is she bending to fit her tribe's emotional needs in the moment? Two, is the United States acting in a way that serves American interests, protects Americans, and holds criminals accountable without creating a new cycle of chaos that spills back into your neighborhood through higher prices, more instability, and more migration pressure? On the first question, I'm not going to pretend cable news is where you go for careful, humble, self-correcting analysis. Cable news is incentive-driven theater. The incentives are ratings, tribal loyalty, and being on the right side of your audience's moral identity. That is why you can find old clips of almost any host saying something that doesn't fit what they are saying now, because the job is not to build a consistent model of the world. It's to keep the emotional coalition together, and that's exactly why this story matters. Because if you are a normal person trying to understand what just happened, you are not being served information. You are being served identity reinforcement. You're being told, if you're one of us, you feel this way. And the other side is being told, if you're one of us, you feel that way. Meanwhile, the actual policy machinery keeps moving, and the bill keeps showing up in your life. Here's what you can't ignore. The Venezuela angle connects directly to the U.S. economy in a way most people don't talk about honestly. Venezuela is not just a human rights story. Venezuela is oil, sanctions, energy flows, black markets, and a whole hemisphere of migration and crime networks that don't stay politely inside borders. When energy gets tighter, your cost of living goes up. When sanctions shift, prices shift. When a regime collapses or fights back, supply shifts. And when supply shifts, the middle and working class get hit first, because you don't get to hedge your grocery bill the way Wall Street hedges a portfolio. You just pay more, or you cut back, or you go into debt. So when you hear someone say, "This is Marco Rubio's dream, not Donald Trump's dream," understand what that implies. It implies there is an internal tug of war between ideological hawks who want to reshape the hemisphere and pragmatic operators who want leverage, stability, and maybe cheaper energy. And if that's true, then what you're watching is not a clean national strategy. It's a coalition of factions using state power for their preferred outcomes. Ask yourself something simple. If this were really about protecting Americans from drug trafficking and criminal networks, why does it always come bundled with domestic messaging aimed at humiliating the other party? If this were really about liberating Venezuelans, why does every faction immediately use it to score points against Americans they hate? That's not how serious stewardship looks. The transcript also raises a point that a lot of people on the right like to make. Maduro was indicted years ago, and during the Biden years, nothing dramatic happened. And now suddenly the Trump administration is acting. That's an emotionally satisfying line because it fits a broader story of Democrats being soft on criminals abroad and hostile to their own citizens at home. But if you want to be evidence-based, you have to go one level deeper than that. Indictments are one thing, statecraft is another. An indictment can exist on paper while policy oscillates between pressure, negotiation, sanctions relief, and reimpose sanctions depending on elections, hostages, energy prices, and international alignment. That's not a defense of anyone. That's just the reality of how the machine works when the incentives change. And it's exactly why normal people don't trust any of this, because it feels like the why is always retrofitted. It feels like the justification is selected after the decision is made, and the moral language is used as a coat of paint. You're not crazy for feeling that. It is. Now, the most explosive detail in the Maddow clip, as presented, is the Honduras pardon claim. If it's true that a president can pardon a figure convicted of massive drug trafficking, and then in the next breath claim that a military or covert action is about fighting drug trafficking, then you are watching the standard collapse in real time. You are watching the government signal drug trafficking is evil when it's politically useful, and negotiable when it benefits our coalition. That is poison to the rule of law. It tells criminals, your fate depends on who you know. It tells citizens, justice is a tool, not a principle. And it tells other countries, don't take our moral speeches seriously, they're for domestic consumption. I also want to be fair here, because there is a legitimate argument on the other side. The argument is that you can oppose drug trafficking and still engage in pardons or deals for reasons of diplomacy, intelligence, or political bargaining. I'm not endorsing that. I'm saying that is how the system will justify it. But here's the problem. If the justification always depends on secret reasons you can't audit, then you don't live in a democracy in the meaningful sense. You live in a managed system where the public is told stories and a hidden class makes trade-offs. That's the trust versus control lens in action. Now, fold in the Brazil point from the transcript. The claim is that the United States sanctioned Brazil for trying to protect itself from a coup by its former president, and that this undermines the moral posture of opposing illegitimate power grabs elsewhere. Again, you don't have to be a Brazil expert to see the pattern. Washington applies pressure in ways that align with its preferred ideological outcomes, and then claims universal principles after the fact. That doesn't mean every sanction is wrong. It means the public deserves a consistent framework. It means you should not accept a world where democracy means people who agree with our foreign policy, and dictator means people we don't like this week. Because when language becomes that flexible, it will eventually be used on you at home. That's the part everyone misses. The same technocratic mindset that says we can label foreign actors however we need to justify our actions will eventually say we can label domestic dissent however we need to justify surveillance, censorship, and control. And yes, that brings me straight to the media angle, because the media is the delivery system for these labels. In the transcript, the commentator mocks MSNBC as rebranding and says Maddow is losing her audience, and he implies her own comment section is full of disagreement. I am not going to pretend I can verify the exact temperature of her comment section from a transcript, but I can tell you something broader that is plainly true. Legacy media has lost trust at a scale that used to be unthinkable. That loss of trust is not just a cultural grievance, it has economic consequences. When people don't trust institutions, they don't invest in the future the same way. They don't believe the inflation numbers. They don't believe the jobs numbers. They don't believe the soft landing. They tighten up, they get defensive, they hoard cash, they buy hard assets, they retreat from risk, or they gamble out of desperation. That shift in psychology is a market force. It affects consumption, saving, investing, housing behavior, and political behavior. It changes everything. Let's connect this to the working class reality, because this is where the elites always try to change the subject. You've spent the last few years watching your grocery bill climb, your rent climb, your insurance climb, your car repairs climb, and you've been told, in polite terms, that you're basically imagining it, or you've been told it's transitory, or you've been told it's the fault of one villain, and if you vote correctly, the pain will go away. Then you look at foreign policy, and you see the same pattern, a confident story delivered with moral certainty and almost no admission of trade-offs. Meanwhile, the trade-offs are real. Sanctions and wars and interventions have costs. They show up in energy prices, in supply chain shocks, in migration pressure, in debt issuance, and in the quiet expansion of the national security state. Do you know what that means in plain English? It means you work harder and get less. It means your wages chase prices instead of building wealth. It means your savings earn less than inflation unless you take risks you don't fully understand. And it means your kids inherit a more fragile system with fewer honest guardrails. That is why it matters that the rationale doesn't stand up to logical scrutiny, as Maddow says in the clip. Because if the rationale is incoherent, the costs are still real. Now, the transcript pulls in another thread. El Salvador, President Nayib Bukele, MS-13, and the idea of sending criminals to jungle concentration camps, which is obviously loaded language. Let's handle this carefully, because this is where the story reveals the ideological split in a very raw way. Bukele is a complicated case. On one hand, his crackdown on gangs has produced a dramatic improvement in day-to-day safety for many ordinary Salvadorans, and anyone who's lived with real gang rule understands why that feels like salvation. On the other hand, the methods raise questions about civil liberties, due process, and the long-term risk of building a security state that can be turned against political opponents. But notice what happens in U.S. media when a leader uses force to restore order. Progressive media tends to frame it as authoritarianism, even if the public in that country feels safer and more free in practical terms. Conservative media tends to frame it as courage, even if there are legitimate concerns about abuses. The truth is, both sides often cherry-pick, because the story is really about their domestic ideology, not the foreign people. And that is the point the Oscar Blue clip is trying to make in a very confrontational way. The argument is that privileged American activists romanticize socialism and revolutionary politics without living under the realities that come with cartel violence, state corruption, and the collapse of basic order. In the transcript, he describes horrifying realities in broad terms, and I'm not going to repeat graphic details, but the core message is clear. People who have never lived through institutional breakdown should be careful about celebrating systems that historically lead to it. Now, you might hear that and think, okay, this is just another culture war rant about white liberals. But again, if you go one level deeper, there's an economic truth embedded in it. When order collapses, the poor get crushed first, the rich leave, the middle class gets drained. The state extracts what it can. Crime becomes a tax, inflation becomes a tax, and the people who preached ideology from a safe distance don't pay the price. That's why this Venezuela story matters for Americans beyond the usual foreign policy crowd, because the United States is not immune to those patterns. We like to think we're above it, but a country that normalizes selective enforcement, narrative manipulation, and debt-financed governance is playing with the same fire, just with nicer branding. Now, let's talk about Hugo Chavez, because the transcript brings him in as the origin story. Chavez is often described as a charismatic leader who promised to help the poor, nationalize resources, and built a new political order. Many Venezuelans genuinely loved him for what they believed he represented, especially early on, and you can acknowledge that without endorsing what followed. But the transcript points to a key institutional shift, weakening term limits, changing the Constitution to allow indefinite rule, and building a system where the leader becomes the state. That's not a Venezuelan-only story, that's a human story. Anytime you remove the guardrails that force leaders to rotate out, you increase the odds that the system becomes personal, corrupt, and brittle. A brittle system can look strong right up until it shatters. It looks like control. It looks like stability. It looks like the adults are in charge. And then when stress hits it, and the whole thing starts to fracture because the institutions underneath were hollowed out. And this is where the story gets wild, and this is the twist most people miss. The argument in the transcript is basically, Venezuela is a dictatorship, and the people are celebrating freedom. But even if Maduro is removed, that does not automatically mean the system becomes free, prosperous, or stable. Removing a figurehead is not the same as rebuilding institutions, restoring trust, and restarting a real economy. A real economy is not a speech. It's contracts, it's property rights, it's predictable courts. It's a currency people trust. It's investment that stays instead of fleeing. It's energy production that's managed competently. It's safety that doesn't depend on bribery. Those things take years to rebuild, and they can be wrecked quickly. And here's the uncomfortable parallel for America. We still have institutions, but trust is cracking. We still have courts, but faith is cracking. We still have elections, but half the country thinks the system is rigged one way or another. We still have markets, but the real economy is increasingly divorced from the financial games played at the top. When a country starts living in two realities, the way the transcript says, that's a danger signal. It means consensus is gone. It means people don't even agree on what happened, much less what should happen. And when that happens, elites tend to reach for control because persuasion stops working. That's why you should pay attention to the way this story is being narrated. The left-leaning narrative tends to be interventions are suspicious, motives are imperial, and America is the problem. The right-leaning narrative tends to be dictators are evil, our opponents are apologists, and strength fixes everything. Both narratives can be partly true and still be dangerously incomplete. Because the real question is not whether Maduro is good or bad. The real question is whether America's institutions can act abroad in a way that is lawful, coherent, and aligned with the interests of ordinary Americans without creating a new cycle of chaos. And the answer depends on whether elites are accountable, which brings us back to the media. Cable news is not built to handle trade-offs. It's built to handle villains. If the story is complex, it gets reduced into a morality play. If the policy has risks, the risks are minimized. If the intervention fails, the failure is blamed on the wrong villain, or blamed on misinformation, or blamed on the public for not being sophisticated enough. That dynamic is why people snap. It's why you see audiences turning on their own favorite hosts. It's why comment sections get nasty. It's why independent media grows, for better and sometimes for worse. Because people sense correctly that the official story is often designed to manage them, not inform them. Now, let's pull in the economic zoom out that has to be said out loud. The United States is running a fiscal trajectory that does not leave room for endless foreign adventures, endless sanctions games, endless intelligence operations, and endless emergency spending without consequences. Debt is not a moral abstraction. Debt is a claim on your future labor, your future taxes, and your future purchasing power. When the government borrows at scale, it competes with private borrowers. When interest rates rise, debt service becomes a larger part of the budget. When debt service grows, politicians either cut something unpopular, raise taxes, or inflate the currency in subtle ways by leaning on monetary policy. And in modern America, the temptation is always the same. Paper it over, kick it down the road, and hope the next election cycle saves you. That's what I mean by a doom loop. The system creates problems with short-term fixes, then uses those problems as the excuse for more control and more spending. It's like using a credit card to pay the minimum on another credit card, and then calling it stability. It feels stable until it doesn't. Now layer foreign policy on top of that. Every disruption abroad that touches oil or shipping or supply chains can add to inflation pressure. Inflation is not just a macroeconomic chart. Inflation is the silent thief that hits the working class hardest, because rich people have assets that inflate, and poor people have bills that inflate. Think about how this lands in your life. Your mortgage payment is fixed if you locked it in, but if you're trying to buy a house now, you're dealing with high prices and higher rates at the same time. Your rent rises because landlords are covering their own higher costs, and because housing supply is constrained. Your car insurance rises because repair costs rise. Your groceries rise because energy and transportation costs ripple through everything. So when you hear foreign policy treated like a morality play, remember that morality play has a price tag. Even if you never see the bill directly, you feel it. That is why it matters that the rationale doesn't stand up to logical scrutiny, as Maddow says in the clip. Because if the rationale is incoherent, the costs are still real. Now, to be fair, there's also a reality that the United States cannot ignore criminal networks and narco states in its hemisphere forever. When regimes are linked, even indirectly, to cartel flows and smuggling networks, the United States gets hit. It gets hit through drugs. It gets hit through migration. It gets hit through corruption. And it gets hit through violence that crosses borders. But here was the honest question. Why does it feel like the same people who can mobilize the full weight of the state abroad often fail to protect order at home? Why does it feel like there is endless energy for foreign projects and endless excuses for domestic decay? You can just tell a family in a struggling town that there's no money for border enforcement, no money for drug treatment, no money for rebuilding industry, no money for public safety, and then turn around and act like you have unlimited capacity to restructure a foreign country. That disconnect is what fuels populism. That disconnect is why trust collapses. And this is where the media hypocrisy becomes more than gossip. It becomes a signal. When a host can compare Trump to Maduro one year, then sound appalled that Maduro is being targeted the next year, that tells you the framework is not principle-based. It's power-based. It's about which team is benefiting from the narrative. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not saying Maddow is a secret Maduro supporter. I am saying The incentives of her ecosystem push her toward interpreting events through a lens that often treats American force as inherently suspect and treats right-leaning leadership as inherently authoritarian. That lens can reveal real dangers, but it can also blind you to the suffering of people living under actual dictatorships. At the same time, the right-wing commentary ecosystem has its own blind spots. It can treat any act of force as automatically righteous if it humiliates the left. It can treat complicated foreign societies like chess pieces. It can forget that law and order abroad means nothing if you don't have a plan to prevent a vacuum, prevent retaliation, and prevent a humanitarian collapse that turns into a migration wave. So if you want to be serious, you have to hold both things in your mind at once. Dictatorships are real and brutal, and people suffer under them. But interventions can also be reckless and self-serving, and they can create chaos that makes suffering worse. That's nuance, and cable news hates nuance because nuance doesn't trend. Now, the transcript includes a Venezuelan voice expressing joy and gratitude, and I want to treat that with respect. If you've lived under corruption and fear and collapse, and you believe a door has opened, your joy is real. Your hope is real. That doesn't make you propaganda. It makes you human. But hope is not a policy. Hope does not rebuild institutions by itself. And if American leaders are using Venezuelans' hope as a backdrop for domestic political theater, that is morally ugly. That is using people as a prop. We've seen that movie before. The other Venezuelan voice in the transcript makes a more sweeping claim that Venezuela already has a democratic president, that Maduro stole the election, and that the United States is finally recognizing a truth. Again, the political dispute over legitimacy is real, and many governments and observers have questioned the credibility of Venezuelan elections and the regime's behavior. But in practical terms, legitimacy is not the same as control. Control is who commands the security forces. Control is who controls the ministries. Control is who controls the money flows. Control is who controls the courts. If those levers remain in the hands of a network built over decades, then the transition is not a simple switch flip. It's a struggle. And if it's a struggle, it can get messy. That messiness can spill into oil markets, migration flows, and regional instability. That's not fear-mongering. That's what happens when states destabilize. You can celebrate the fall of a strong man and still be sober about the turbulence that follows. Now, let's tie this to the border, because the transcript does something important when it mentions the Darien Gap and the bridge between Venezuela and Colombia. Those are not just dramatic visuals. They are proof that political failure becomes human movement, and human movement becomes political pressure in the United States. When millions of people leave their country over years, they don't teleport. They walk, they pay smugglers, they cross dangerous terrain, they pass through cartel-controlled corridors, and they end up at borders where governments either enforce law or pretend it's not happening. And when enforcement fails, ordinary Americans pay in strained services, stressed communities, wage pressure at the bottom, and rising political conflict. You can be compassionate toward migrants and still be angry at the elites who created the conditions, both abroad and at home, that turned mass migration into a permanent crisis. Compassion without control is not compassion. It's chaos. And chaos always hurts the vulnerable first. Now, this is where the story intersects with the U.S. labor market in a way that polite people avoid saying out loud. A surge of low-skilled labor supply can suppress wages at the bottom and strain housing availability, especially in cities already struggling with affordability. Meanwhile, elite industries that benefit from cheap labor and cheap services keep telling you that border enforcement is cruel, porque es impuro, while they live in gated neighborhoods and outsource the costs to working-class communities. That's the people versus institutions lens in real life. Institutions decide. People absorb. Now, let's talk about the real economy versus financial games lens, because foreign policy always gets financialized in the end. Sanctions regimes create winners and losers. They create trading opportunities for connected firms. They create compliance industries. They create loopholes. They create black markets. They create special licenses and exceptions that insiders understand and normal people never even hear about. If you think that's conspiratorial, just look at how modern governance works. Every major rule creates a market. Every restriction creates a broker. Every crisis creates a contractor. The question is not whether money moves. The question is who gets to move it first and who gets stuck paying retail prices after the fact. And if you want to understand why people are so furious, it's because they see a pattern of elites insulating themselves. The bureaucrats don't lose their jobs when a policy fails. The pundits don't lose their platforms when they're wrong. The politicians don't pay personally when debt explodes. The financial firms often get bailed out when bets go bad. Meanwhile, the working class is told to adapt and reskill and stop complaining. That is not a sustainable social contract. That is a pressure cooker. Now, this is why the Maddow moment is not trivial. When someone like Maddow says, "I don't think many Americans have any idea why the United States did this," she is accidentally telling you something true. Most Americans don't know because the system doesn't want them to know in a detailed, auditable way. It wants them to feel a certain way, not understand. If the action was justified, the justification should be clear in plain English. If there are trade-offs, they should be admitted. If there are risks, they should be stated. If there is a plan, it should be described. If there is no plan, the public should know that too, because the public is the one that pays. Instead, what you often get is a fog of moral language and partisan sniping. One side calls it liberation. The other side calls it imperialism. And while you're fighting in the comments, the administrative state keeps operating with minimal oversight. Here, as a question that cuts through the noise, who benefits when the public is divided into two emotional camps that can agree on basic facts? The answer is not you. A divided public is easier to manage. A divided public is less able to demand accountability. A divided public is more likely to accept emergency measures because fear is a lever. And yes, that connects to the domestic digital control trajectory that should worry you, no matter what party you vote for. When trust collapses, elites reach for monitoring. They call it safety, they call it moderation, they call it disinformation control, they call it public health, they call it national security. But the effect is the same: more discretion for institutions, less autonomy for citizens. If you want to know where that road goes, look at any system that justifies power with permanent emergencies. Emergencies never end. The tools never go away. The scope always expands. And the definition of threat gets broader over time. That's why the Venezuela story is not just foreign, it's a mirror. It's a test of whether Americans still demand coherent governance, or whether we accept narrative management as a substitute for accountable decision-making. Now, I want to say something that will annoy partisans on both sides, and I'm saying it because it's true. The progressive technocratic left often treats the public as a problem to be managed, not a citizenry to be persuaded. But the right-wing establishment often treats its voters as a battery to be drained, not a base to be served. One side moralizes control. The other side markets control as freedom while quietly cutting insider deals. That's why so many people feel politically homeless. They don't want chaos, but they don't trust the managers. They don't want authoritarianism, but they don't trust the institutions that claim to fight it. They don't want endless war, but they also don't want narco states on their doorstep. They want competence, consistency, and honesty. And the tragedy is that those are the exact things the current media ecosystem is least able to deliver, because outrage is profitable and clarity is dangerous. Clarity forces accountability. Outrage can be monetized without ever solving anything. So what should you take from this, in practical terms, as someone trying to protect your life and your family? First, learn to separate facts from framing. When you hear a host say someone is defending a dictator, ask what was actually said and what evidence was offered. When you hear a host say an operation had no casualties, ask whether that S verified or whether it S just a talking point designed to sanitize force. Second, follow incentives, because incentives explain behavior better than virtue speeches. If a policy shift conveniently aligns with election cycles, energy prices, or internal party power struggles, that's not proof of conspiracy, but it is a clue. Third, remember that foreign policy is domestic policy with a time delay. It affects energy, inflation, migration, and debt. If you care about your rent, your savings, and your job security, you cannot afford to treat foreign policy as a cable news soap opera. You have to treat it as part of the system that shapes your cost of living. Fourth, on the personal side, you need resilient strategies that don't depend on elites behaving responsibly, because history says they often won't. That means keeping your household balance sheet as strong as you can, reducing high-interest debt where possible, maintaining an emergency buffer, and avoiding lifestyle commitments that assume everything will remain stable. It means building skills that travel, relationships that matter, and local networks that can help you when institutions fail or get politicized. I'm not telling you to live in fear. I'm telling you to live awake. There's a difference. Fear is paralysis. Awareness is preparation. Fifth, protect your mind. The media economy is designed to hijack your attention and convert your anger into clicks. If you spend every day marinating in outrage without translating it into clear thinking and practical action, you're being harvested. Pick a few high-quality sources, demand evidence, and don't let anyone outsource your judgment. Now, let's bring this home with the simplest, most honest closing question. Do you feel like you are being governed by people who tell you the truth in plain language, admit trade-offs, and accept consequences when they're wrong? Or do you feel like you're being managed by people who treat your consent as optional and your trust as something they can manufacture with better messaging? Because that's what this Maddow moment is really about. It's not about whether you like her haircut or her tone. It's about whether the public is waking up to the fact that the narrative is not the same thing as reality, and that the people at the top often confuse control with competence. I want to know where you land on this. When you hear the competing stories about Venezuela, Do you think the United States is acting from a coherent strategy that protects Americans and respects the reality on the ground? Or does it feel like another episode of elites freelancing with power and asking you to clap or boo on cue? Do you think legacy media is informing people or managing them? And what was the moment that made you realize the difference? And finally, do you believe the public is starting to break out of these two manufactured realities? Or are we headed toward a deeper split where the same facts can even be agreed on? Tell me in the comments, because I read them and I want to see how you're connecting these dots. And if this helped you see the structure behind the headlines instead of just the noise on top, hit like so more people find it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.